40 million people. That is not just a number. That is an ocean of blood. That is 10% of every human soul alive on Earth at that time. Imagine a world where 1 out of every 10 people you know simply vanishes. They were not just killed. They were erased. The Mongol Empire did not just win wars. They harvested lives. They turned the act of killing into a cold, calculated machine. They were the most efficient dealers of death the world has ever seen. This is not a story of glory. This is a story of how humanity was broken. The year is 1206. A new power is rising from the high steppes of Asia. They do not have massive cities. They do not have heavy iron armor. But they have something much more dangerous. They have a system. For the next 150 years, the Mongol armies would march across 3 continents. They left nothing behind but smoke and bone. Most armies in history fought for land. Some fought for gold. The Mongols fought for total submission. If you fought back, you did not just lose. You ceased to exist. Their brutality was not accidental. It was their primary weapon. It was fast. It was never clean. And it was never, ever merciful. To understand the Mongols, you have to understand their logic. They did not see people. They saw targets. They treated mass execution like a clerk treats paperwork. It was a job. And they were very good at their job. Let's look at the Battle of Legnica in 1241. It happened in Poland. A massive European alliance stood against them. Brave Polish soldiers. Moavian troops. Even the legendary Templar Knights. These were the elite. The best of the West. In a single day, the Mongols tore them apart. The European army was shattered. But the Mongols did not celebrate. They had work to do. They needed an accurate count. They needed to report back to their commanders exactly how many enemies had been sent to the afterlife. They did not count bodies. That was too slow. Bodies are heavy. Bodies are hard to move. Instead, they walked through the mud and the blood with sharp knives. They went body by body. They reached down, grabbed the head, and sliced off the right ear. Every single soldier. One by one. When they were finished, the Mongol officers opened 9 large sacks. These were not small bags. These were industrial-sized sacks used for grain. By the time the sun set, all 9 sacks were overflowing. 9 full bags of human ears from one single afternoon of work. This was the Mongol office work. Collect, count, report, move on. It was a cold, terrifying efficiency. But this was only the beginning. The ears were for the soldiers. The heads? The heads were for the survivors. When the Mongols reached a city with thick walls, they did not always wait for the gates to open. They used psychology. They used terror as a siege engine. They would gather the severed heads of the people they had already killed. These were the heads of friends, the heads of brothers, the heads of the soldiers who had gone out to defend the city just days before. They loaded these heads into their giant catapults. Imagine standing on a city wall. You are hungry. You are tired. You are looking at the Mongol flags on the horizon. Suddenly, the sky turns dark. Objects are flying through the air. You think they are rocks. But they don't sound like rocks when they hit the ground. They are soft. They bounce. You look down at your feet. It is the face of your neighbor. It is the face of your cousin. The Mongols were literally raining death from the sky. They didn't just want to break your walls. They wanted to break your mind. And it worked. Fear travels faster than any horse. The news of these tactics reached cities weeks before the Mongol army did. By the time the Mongols arrived, The people inside were already dead in their hearts. This was the foundation of their empire. A foundation built on 9 sacks of ears and a sky full of heads. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. The Mongols understood something most conquerors ignored. You do not need to swing a sword to kill a man. You just need to take away his tomorrow. In the dry, sun-scorched lands of Central Asia and Persia, life was a miracle. It was a miracle held together by water. For generations, the people there had built incredible systems of underground canals called khanats. These were engineering masterpieces. They brought water from the mountains to the deserts. They turned dust into gardens. They turned death into life. Then the Mongols arrived. They didn't just want the cities. They wanted to break the future. They looked at these irrigation systems and saw a weakness. They didn't just block them. They ripped them apart. They filled the tunnels with stones. They poisoned the sources. They destroyed the work of centuries in a single afternoon. The result was a silent massacre. Without water, the crops turned to straw. Without crops, the animals died. And then, the people began to vanish. Entire regions that had been green and vibrant became gray. They became dust. Some of these areas never recovered. Not in 50 years. Not in 500 years. Even today, if you look at the satellite images of certain parts of Central Asia, you can still see the scars. The Mongols figured out that time is a better killer than any blade. They didn't need to hunt you down. They just had to wait for you to get thirsty. But sometimes, they didn't want to wait for years. Sometimes they wanted to watch the life leave your eyes in weeks. This brings us to the Mongol siege. If a city was strong, the Mongols did not waste their soldiers on the walls. They were patient. They were as patient as a spider. They would surround the city completely. They blocked every gate. They blocked every river. They even blocked the narrow paths used by rats. Nothing went in. Nothing came out. The first week is always the hardest for the mind. You realize you are trapped. You look at your children. You look at your grain stores. You start to do the math. By the second week, the hunger starts to bite. It is not a sharp pain. It is a dull, heavy ache. It makes your head spin. It makes your temper short. By the second month, the city is no longer a city. It is a graveyard of the living. People start to eat things that are not food. They boil leather belts. They chew on their own shoes. They hunt for rats in the sewers. Historical reports say that in some cities, the desperation reached a level so dark that people stopped looking each other in the eye. They were afraid of what they might see in a neighbor's hunger. Disease is the final guest at the table. In a crowded, starving city, a simple fever becomes an executioner. The plague spreads like wildfire. People die in their beds. They die in the streets. They die while trying to pray. When the Mongols finally decided the city was weak enough, they would simply walk in. They didn't find warriors. They found walking skeletons. The Mongols didn't do this because they were lazy. They did it as a message to the next city. They wanted the world to know that fighting back was not an option. Surrender meant you might live as a slave. Resistance meant you would watch your world turn into dust before you died of hunger. It was cold. It was calculated. It was the Mongol way. And yet, as horrible as starvation was, it was still impersonal. The Mongols were just getting started. If you really made them angry, they had ways to make your death a very personal, very slow performance. Sometimes, the Mongols didn't want to kill thousands. They wanted to kill one. but they wanted that one death to speak to millions. They didn't just want you dead. They wanted you to regret every breath you had ever taken. They wanted your death to be a story that mothers would tell their children to keep them quiet. This was the art of the personal message. Take the story of a Persian nobleman. He was a man of high status. He was proud. He refused to bow. He thought his walls and his wealth would protect him. He was wrong. When the Mongols finally caught him, they didn't reach for a sword. They reached for a sheep. They took thick, heavy sheep fat. They smeared it all over his body, every inch. Then, they wrapped him tight. They used layers of heavy felt. It was like a thick, rough blanket. They tied it so tight he couldn't move a finger. He couldn't even scream properly because the felt was pressed against his lips. Then, they carried him out into the desert. They laid him on the sand. They didn't leave him alone. They sat down nearby. They made a fire. They talked. They laughed. And they waited for the sun to do the work. The desert sun is a monster. It began to beat down on the felt. Inside, the temperature started to rise. The sheep fat began to melt. But it had nowhere to go. It began to cook into his skin. Imagine the heat. You are trapped in a dark, hot prison made of your own skin and boiling grease. You can feel your life melting away. You are being baked alive from the outside in. This wasn't a quick execution. This lasted for hours. This was the Mongol way of saying, you thought you were important. Now, you are just a meal for the sun. But the Mongols didn't just care about the body. They cared about the soul. To a Mongol, the head was the most sacred part of a human being. It was where the spirit lived. If you wanted to truly destroy a man, you didn't just stop his heart. You had to destroy his eternity. There is a story about an iron nail. It started with the Persians. After a small victory against a Mongol unit, the Persians took their prisoners. They drove iron nails straight into the Mongols' skulls. It was meant to be the ultimate insult. They weren't just killing the soldiers. They were trying to trap their souls so they could never reach the afterlife. The Mongols had a long memory. They didn't forget an insult. When they returned with a massive army, they sought out everyone involved. They didn't just kill them. They turned the nail in the skull into a nightmare. They believed that by driving metal into the head, they were erasing the person from existence. Not just in this world, but in the next. This leads to one of the most famous rules in Mongol history, the no-blood rule. The Mongols believed that the earth was sacred. Spilling royal blood on the ground was a sin against their sky god, Tungri. It sounds like a mercy. It sounds like they were trying to be polite. It was the exact opposite. Because they couldn't spill blood, they had to get creative. They had to find ways to kill people without breaking the skin. They would snap spines over their knees. They would crush people under heavy boards. They would sew every opening of a person's body shut and throw them into a river to drown. By following their religious rules, they ended up inventing the most agonizing ways to die in human history. They were not being holy. They were being efficient. The Mongols did not see people as individuals. They saw them as resources. When a city fell, the killing was not random. It was a sorting process. They treated human beings like livestock. This was the birth of the assembly line of death. They would march the survivors out into an open field. Then, the categorization began. The first group were the craftsmen, the blacksmiths, the weavers, the engineers. These people were too valuable to kill. They were tied together and shipped thousands of miles back to Mongolia. They were the engines of the empire. They spent the rest of their lives building weapons and palaces for the people who had murdered their families. To the Mongols, a man's skill was just another piece of loot, like a gold coin or a fine horse. The second group were the young men. They were not made into slaves. They were made into harash, the living boards. This was perhaps the most cold-hearted tactic in the history of warfare. The Mongols would force these prisoners to the front of their army. When they attacked the next city, these men were forced to carry ladders and heavy shields. They had to walk directly into the arrows of their own countrymen. Imagine being a soldier on a city wall. You look down to fire your bow, and you see your own brother. You see your own father. The Mongols would walk safely behind this wall of human flesh. If the defenders stopped shooting to save their families, the Mongols would climb the walls and kill everyone. If the defenders kept shooting, they had to live with the fact that they had murdered their own blood. The Mongols didn't just use your body, they used your heart against you. For everyone else, the old, the weak, the useless, the Mongols had a different system. It was the system of the quota. In the city of Urgench, the Mongol commanders didn't want to waste time. They had more cities to conquer. So, they gave each soldier a job. Every soldier in the unit was assigned 24 prisoners. They had to execute them. No exceptions. No excuses. It was like a factory shift. You wake up, you kill your 24 people, you clean your blade, and you go to sleep. Historians estimate that in that one operation alone, 1.2 million people were killed. It wasn't a massacre born of anger or heat-of-the-moment violence. It was a massacre of math. It was organized. It was quiet. It was efficient. They turned the act of mass murder into a boring, repetitive task. And if you were a leader, if you were a king or a general who dared to resist, you didn't get the mercy of a quick execution. You became part of the entertainment. There was a rival warlord named Jamuka. He had once been a close friend of Genghis Khan, but he betrayed him. When Jamuka captured some of Genghis's generals, he didn't just behead them. He lined up 70 giant metal cauldrons. He filled them with water and brought them to a boil. Then, he threw the generals in alive while their soldiers watched. The smell of the steam and the sound of the screams stayed with the survivors forever. The Mongols learned from this. They realized that fear is a currency. If you make someone's death horrible enough, 10 other cities will surrender without you having to fire a single arrow. They didn't just want to win the war, they wanted to win every war that hadn't even started yet. The Mongols were not just soldiers, they were artists of psychological trauma. They understood that a dead body is just a corpse, but a display of dead bodies is a message. They didn't just want to kill you, they wanted to use your remains to build monuments that would freeze the blood of anyone who saw them. In 1221, the Mongols reached the Persian city of Nishapur. It was a center of culture, filled with poets, scientists, and families. But during the battle, Genghis Khan's favorite son-in-law was killed. The revenge was not a simple execution. It was an erasure. The Mongol daughter of Genghis Khan demanded that not a single soul be left alive, not even the dogs or the cats. Once the city was silenced, the Mongols didn't just walk away. They began a massive construction project. They gathered the hundreds of thousands of bodies and began to decapitate them. They separated the heads into categories: men, women, and children. Then, they built massive pyramids out of the skulls. These were not small piles. They were towers of bone that stood high above the ruins of the city. Imagine walking across the desert and seeing a mountain of white bone on the horizon, realizing that every brick in that mountain was once a person who laughed, cried, and loved. This wasn't just madness. It was advertising. After Nishapur, other cities didn't even try to fight. They saw the towers of bone and opened their gates immediately. The message was clear: our mercy is a pyramid of your children's heads. Do not test us. But for the nobility, the Mongols saved their most creative no-blood executions. They believed that if you were a person of high rank, you deserved a death that was both honorable and agonizing. This led to the infamous victory feast at the Battle of the Kalka River. The Mongols had captured several Russian princes. Instead of beheading them, they laid the princes flat on the grass. They placed heavy wooden platforms over their bodies. Then, the Mongol generals sat down on top of these boards. They brought out roasted meat, fermented milk, and music. They held a grand victory celebration. As the generals laughed and sang, their weight, and the weight of the furniture, began to slowly crush the men underneath. Every time a general shifted his weight or stamped his feet to the music, the boards pressed harder. The princes were being slowly suffocated and crushed into the mud. The Mongols ate their dinner to the sound of breaking ribs and muffled gasps for air. This was the ultimate insult. To the Mongols, these kings were not even human anymore. They were literally furniture. Even the highest religious leaders were not safe. When Baghdad fell in 1258, the Caliph, the most powerful man in the Islamic world, was taken prisoner. To avoid spilling his royal blood on the earth, the Mongols rolled him inside a thick, expensive carpet. They tied the ends shut. Then, they rode their war horses over him. The carpet muffled the sound of the hooves hitting flesh. It kept the blood inside. It was a clean, holy death by Mongol standards. But inside that dark, wool prison, the Caliph felt every bone in his body shatter one by one. The center of world knowledge, the great libraries of Baghdad, were burned to ash that same week. The Tigris River ran black with the ink of destroyed books and red with the blood of 2 million people. The Mongols didn't just kill a leader, they stumped a civilization into the dirt. We have reached the end. Number 1. This is not a single torture method. This is not a specific way to snap a bone or burn a skin. This is the total solution. This is the reason why, when you look at the maps of the 13th century, entire civilizations simply stop existing. The Mongols called it feeding the horses. To the rest of the world, it was the end of days. When a city resisted for too long, or when they killed a Mongol diplomat, the Great Khan would not just order an attack. He would order an erasure. This was a cold, systematic process designed to turn a bustling metropolis into a flat field of grass where horses could graze. They didn't just want you dead, they wanted it to be as if you were never born. The process was terrifyingly organized. First, they would gather every living soul outside the city walls. They would separate them like they were sorting grain. The useful were enslaved, the beautiful were taken, and the rest? The rest were lined up for the harvest. Every soldier was given a quota. In some cities, each soldier had to kill 400 people. They didn't use arrows for this, arrows cost money. They used axes. They used clubs. They used their bare hands. At the city of Merv, historians estimate that over 1 million people were executed in a few days. Genghis Khan sat on a golden throne in the middle of the plain, watching the slaughter like a man watching a theater performance. He wanted to see the efficiency. He wanted to ensure that the job was done correctly. Once the people were gone, the demolition teams moved in. They didn't just burn the houses. They tore down the walls stone by stone. They diverted rivers to flow over the ruins, washing away the foundations. They pulled up the paved streets. They burned the libraries until the ash was inches deep. They wanted to make sure that if a traveler passed by 10 years later, he wouldn't even know a city had ever stood there. They were literally deleting history. The psychological impact of this total erasure was so powerful that it created a phenomenon of preemptive surrender. People would hear that the Mongols were 100 miles away, and they would kill their own leaders and open the gates, hoping that by being fast and obedient, they might avoid the feeding of the horses. The Mongols had turned terror into a form of gravity. It pulled everything toward them. They built the largest connected land empire in human history, covering 24 million square kilometers. But it wasn't built on gold or laws. It was built on the calculated use of the most extreme pain the human mind could imagine. From the 9 sacks of ears to the molten silver in the eyes, every act was a brick in a wall of fear. They were the storm that didn't just break the trees, but salted the earth so nothing could ever grow again. They treated the human race like a field that needed to be mowed. And for 150 years, the world was their meadow. 40 million lives. 10% of the planet. Gone. Not by accident, but by design. That is the true legacy of the Mongol Empire. It wasn't just a kingdom. It was a machine that turned human life into silence. And as the wind blows over the empty plains of Central Asia today, that silence is still there. If you listen closely, you can still hear the echo of the 9 sacks being filled. If you enjoy dark, untold history, subscribe because we uncover what others won't.